As State Senator Angela Robinson steered her sleek black sedan through the dimly lit streets of downtown, the warm glow of streetlights cast shadows across her tired face. She'd just wrapped up an exhausting legislative session focused on education reform, her passion project that kept her at the Capitol well past sunset. Her mind wandered to the stack of unread emails and the morning briefing she needed to prepare, when suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Officer Sarah Miller sat in her patrol car, drumming her fingers against the steering wheel as she ran the license plate. The clock showed 11:42 p.m. She'd been having a frustrating night, 3 failed stops and a mountain of paperwork waiting. When she spotted the minor taillight issue on the Mercedes, something about it rubbed her the wrong way. Angela pulled over smoothly, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel just as her father had taught her years ago. She'd learned these unspoken rules early. Keep calm. Move slowly, no sudden movements. Through her side mirror, she watched the officer approach, noticing the stiff posture and hand already resting on her holster. License and registration, Officer Miller barked, her flashlight beam harsh against Angela's face. The senator reached slowly for her glove compartment, maintaining a steady voice as she responded. "Of course, officer. May I ask why I was stopped?" Miller's jaw tightened. "Broken taillight. Just give me your documents." Angela knew her car had passed inspection just last week, but she kept her voice level. "I understand, officer. I'm reaching for my documents now." As she handed over her license, she added, "I should mention that I'm State Senator Rob." "Step out of the vehicle." Miller cut her off, her tone sharp enough to slice through the night air. "I don't care who you think you are. Exit the car now." Angela's heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "Officer, I'd like to request a supervisor. I haven't done anything wrong, and I don't understand why." Before she could finish, Miller yanked the car door open. A group of late-night diners across the street noticed the commotion, phones already raised to record what was unfolding. The situation was spiraling, and Angela could feel years of careful composure being tested as she faced the barrel of prejudice wearing a badge. A young woman among the onlookers whispered to her friend, "That's Senator Robinson. I just saw her speak at my college last week." But their growing concern couldn't stop what happened next as Miller roughly pulled Angela from her car, the senator's perfectly pressed suit catching on the doorframe as her world turned sideways. The night air carried whispers and the electronic chirp of phones recording, while red and blue lights continued their endless dance across the scene, highlighting every moment of what would soon become a national conversation about power, prejudice, and the long road to change. The tension in the air thickened as Officer Miller's grip tightened on her service weapon. "I said, get out of the car." She barked, her voice carrying an edge that made nearby witnesses flinch. Senator Robinson felt her legal training kick in, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. "Officer, I am complying, but I need you to understand that this stop appears to be without cause," Angela stated firmly, slowly unbuckling her seatbelt. The surrounding crowd had grown, their phone cameras capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Some began live streaming, their hushed commentary adding to the electric atmosphere. Miller's face contorted with barely contained anger. "Put your hands where I can see them," she demanded, ignoring Angela's measured response. The senator raised her hands deliberately, her silver bracelet, a gift from her late mother, catching the harsh street light. "I am State Senator Angela Robinson, and I'm requesting a supervisor immediately," she announced loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. Miller's response was swift and aggressive. She grabbed Angela's wrist, twisting it behind her back with unnecessary force. "Playing the status card won't work with me," Miller sneered, close enough that only Angela could hear the contempt in her voice. A young man in the crowd shouted, "Hey, that's excessive force." His friend tried to quiet him, but the words had already pierced the night air. Miller's head snapped toward the voice, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and something else. Was it fear? The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension, but instead of backing down, Miller seemed to double down. She roughly pushed Angela against the car, the cold metal pressing against her cheek. The senator's glasses clattered to the ground, and someone in the crowd gasped. "Stop resisting," Miller shouted, though Angela hadn't moved a muscle. The words were familiar, a phrase too often used to justify what came next. Angela thought of her father's words. Sometimes dignity is staying calm when they try to take it from you. From the growing crowd came more voices of protest. "She's not resisting. This is wrong." A local shop owner emerged from his store, phone held high, adding another angle to the documented injustice. The air crackled with tension as more patrol cars approached, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue. What Officer Miller didn't notice, focused as she was on maintaining her show of force, was the press van that had just pulled up. Local news, drawn by the social media buzz already building around the incident, arrived just in time to capture what would become a defining moment in the ongoing conversation about police reform. The night air carried the weight of history, as another episode of prejudice, masquerading as procedure, unfolded under the watchful eyes of dozens of cameras, each recording a story that would soon shake the foundations of the city's power structures. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the night as Officer Miller roughly secured them around Senator Robinson's wrists. The crowd's murmurs turned to outraged voices as Angela was pushed toward the patrol car, her normally pristine suit now wrinkled and dirty from the rough handling. "You're making a serious mistake," Angela said calmly, even as Miller shoved her head down to force her into the backseat. The senator's dignity remained intact, though her body ached from the unnecessary roughness. Through the window, she could see the news cameras arriving, their bright lights illuminating the scene like an impromptu stage. "Keep your mouth shut," Miller snapped, slamming the door with such force that the entire car shook. The officer's face was visible through the window, a mix of anger and something else, perhaps the first flickers of doubt as she noticed the growing media presence. Inside the patrol car, Angela closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. She could hear the muffled sounds of the crowd outside growing larger and more vocal. Her phone, still in her purse on the front seat of her car, was probably buzzing with messages. Her chief of staff would have been notified by now. Several other police cars had arrived, their officers emerging to control the crowd. One senior officer, a sergeant by his stripes, approached Miller with a concerned expression. Angela could read his lips through the window. "Did you run her ID?" Miller's posture stiffened defensively. The growing chorus of voices outside the car became clearer as more people recognized her. "That's Senator Robinson. She sponsored the education reform bill. Someone call the chief." The news cameras were rolling, capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming a public relations disaster for the department. A tap on the window made Angela turn. A young officer, looking nervous, peered in at her. His eyes widened with recognition, and he quickly stepped away to speak urgently into his radio. The wheels of justice were finally starting to turn, but not in the direction Officer Miller had planned. Through the windshield, Angela could see Miller arguing with the sergeant, her gestures becoming increasingly agitated as reality began to sink in. More senior officers were arriving, their faces grave as they assessed the situation. The news crews had multiplied, and social media was already exploding with footage of the arrest. Inside the car, despite the discomfort of the handcuffs and the humiliation of the situation, Senator Robinson maintained her composure. She'd fought for justice from the Senate floor. Now she was experiencing firsthand why her work was so crucial. This incident would become more than just another case of prejudice. It would become a catalyst for the change she'd been fighting for. The night air was thick with tension as red and blue lights continued to flash, illuminating a scene that would soon make headlines across the nation. What started as a routine traffic stop was about to become a defining moment in the ongoing struggle for equality and police accountability. The precinct buzzed with nervous energy as news of Senator Robinson's arrest spread through the building like wildfire. Desk Sergeant James Martinez was the first to recognize her as officers led her through the booking area, her handcuffs still firmly in place despite her cooperation. "Hold everything," Martinez called out, his face paling as he rushed forward. "That's State Senator Robinson." The booking officers froze, their routine procedures suddenly feeling very wrong. Officer Miller, standing nearby with crossed arms, felt the first real tremor of fear run through her body. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the scene as Captain Sarah Thompson burst through the doors, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Get those cuffs off her immediately," she barked, shooting a withering glare at Miller. As an officer fumbled with the handcuffs, the senator maintained her dignified silence, though the red marks on her wrists told their own story. Phones started ringing throughout the precinct. First the front desk, then the captain's office, then seemingly every line in the building. The mayor's office was calling. The governor's office was calling. Local news stations were calling. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control it. "Senator Robinson," Captain Thompson began, her voice heavy with apology. "I cannot express how deeply." "Save it for the press conference, Captain," Angela interrupted quietly, rubbing her wrists. "Right now, I'd like to file a formal complaint." The words sent a ripple through the gathered officers. Miller, still standing near the booking desk, felt the blood drain from her face. Security cameras captured every moment as higher-ranking officials began arriving. The police chief himself walked in, still adjusting his tie, clearly called from home. His face darkened as he watched the body cam footage on a nearby monitor, Officer Miller's biased behavior playing out in high definition. The precinct's usual late-night quiet had been replaced by a storm of activity. Officers whispered among themselves, watching as their superiors huddled in urgent discussion. Legal advisors hurried through the halls, files clutched to their chests, while the department's public relations team assembled in a nearby conference room. Through it all, Senator Robinson sat calmly in the captain's office, making phone calls of her own. Her chief of staff had arrived, along with her lawyer, both ready to ensure this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug. The night was far from over, and the repercussions were just beginning to unfold. The morning news exploded with footage of Senator Robinson's arrest. Every major network played the videos on loop. The aggressive stop, the rough handling, the dignified senator being forced into a police car. Social media platforms were flooded with different angles captured by bystanders, each clip more damning than the last. Officer Miller's bodycam footage leaked online, revealing every prejudiced comment and unnecessary escalation. The audio was crystal clear. "I don't care who you think you are," echoed across millions of smartphones and laptops, accompanied by the visual of Miller's aggressive behavior toward the calm, professional senator. The police department's phones wouldn't stop ringing. Civil rights organizations demanded action. Community leaders called for protests. The mayor scheduled an emergency press conference, his political advisors scrambling to manage the crisis. Outside the precinct, news vans lined the street like vultures, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky. Inside her office, Senator Robinson watched the coverage with her team. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from fellow legislators, community leaders, and constituents. But it wasn't just anger she felt. It was determination. This incident would become a turning point. National news picked up the story by mid-morning. "State Senator racially profiled and arrested" became the headline everyone was discussing. Political commentators debated the implications while social justice advocates pointed to the incident as proof of systemic problems within law enforcement. The police chief faced a barrage of questions at his hastily arranged press conference. "We are conducting a thorough investigation," he promised, sweat visible on his forehead. "Officer Miller has been placed on immediate administrative leave." But the reporters weren't satisfied, pressing for details about past complaints, department policies, and plans for reform. Social media campaigns sprouted up. Hashtag Justice for Senator Robinson and hashtag Policy via Israel began trending nationwide. Video clips of the senator's previous speeches about police reform circulated widely, her words from months ago now carrying prophetic weight. The incident had become more than just a wrongful arrest. It was a catalyst for a national conversation about power, privilege, and prejudice wearing a badge. Internal Affairs investigators pored over Officer Miller's personnel file, uncovering a pattern of complaints that had been previously overlooked. The thick manila folder revealed multiple incidents of excessive force and racial bias, each marked as unsubstantiated by previous supervisors who had chosen to look the other way. Senator Robinson spent her days dividing time between legislative duties and meetings with civil rights attorneys. Her office became a hub of activity, with legal experts and policy advisors working to transform this personal incident into meaningful change. She appeared on national news shows, her composed demeanor and articulate responses drawing praise from viewers across the political spectrum. The police department's internal investigation moved with unprecedented speed, driven by intense public scrutiny and political pressure. Body camera footage from Miller's previous arrests was reviewed, revealing the disturbing pattern of escalating routine stops involving minorities. Each video added another nail to the coffin of her law enforcement career. Department brass squirmed under questioning about their hiring and training practices. How had Miller's behavioral patterns gone unchecked for so long? The chief of police faced uncomfortable questions about the department's culture and accountability measures. Senior officers who had dismissed previous complaints found themselves under investigation as well. Miller, suspended without pay, watched her career crumble from the isolation of her apartment. Her police union representatives advised her to remain silent, but leaked text messages between her and other officers painted a damaging picture of ingrained prejudices and casual racism within the force. At the state capitol, Senator Robinson channeled her experience into action. She introduced new legislation requiring enhanced bias training, stricter oversight of officer conduct, and independent review boards for police complaints. Her fellow legislators, many of whom had witnessed her dignified handling of the incident, rallied behind her proposals. Community activists who had long fought for police reform found an unexpected ally in the senator. Her first-hand experience lent powerful credibility to their cause, and her political skills helped bridge gaps between reform advocates and law enforcement leadership willing to embrace change. The incident was transforming from a personal injustice into a catalyst for systemic reform. Internal Affairs investigators pored over Officer Miller's personnel file, uncovering a pattern of complaints that had been previously overlooked. The thick manila folder revealed multiple incidents of excessive force and racial bias, each marked as unsubstantiated by previous supervisors who had chosen to look the other way. Senator Robinson spent her days dividing time between legislative duties and meetings with civil rights attorneys. Her office became a hub of activity, with legal experts and policy advisors working to transform this personal incident into meaningful change. She appeared on national news shows, her composed demeanor and articulate responses drawing praise from viewers across the political spectrum. The police department's internal investigation moved with unprecedented speed, driven by intense public scrutiny and political pressure. Body camera footage from Miller's previous arrests was reviewed, revealing a disturbing pattern of escalating routine stops involving minorities. Each video added another nail to the coffin of her law enforcement career. Department brass squirmed under questioning about their hiring and training practices. How had Miller's behavioral patterns gone unchecked for so long? The chief of police faced uncomfortable questions about the department's culture and accountability measures. Senior officers who had dismissed previous complaints found themselves under investigation as well. Miller, suspended without pay, watched her career crumble from the isolation of her apartment. Her police union representatives advised her to remain silent, but leaked text messages between her and other officers painted a damaging picture of ingrained prejudices and casual racism within the force. At the state capitol, Senator Robinson channeled her experience into action. She introduced new legislation requiring enhanced bias training, stricter oversight of officer conduct, and independent review boards for police complaints. Her fellow legislators, many of whom had witnessed her dignified handling of the incident, rallied behind her proposals. Community activists who had long fought for police reform found an unexpected ally in the senator. Her first-hand experience lent powerful credibility to their cause, and her political skills helped bridge gaps between reform advocates and law enforcement leadership willing to embrace change. The incident was transforming from a personal injustice into a catalyst for systemic reform. The transformative power of Senator Robinson's ordeal manifested in sweeping changes across the state's law enforcement landscape. The police department completely overhauled its training protocols, implementing rigorous bias screening and mandatory cultural sensitivity programs. Officer Miller's termination became final after a thorough investigation revealed years of discriminatory behavior. The state legislature passed the Robinson Police Accountability Act with unprecedented bipartisan support. The law established independent oversight committees, mandated body camera usage with strict penalties for violations, and created a statewide database tracking officer misconduct. Police unions initially resisted, but found themselves unable to counter the overwhelming public support for reform. Senator Robinson's office received thousands of letters from citizens sharing similar experiences of bias. She worked tirelessly to ensure each story was heard, using these testimonies to strengthen future legislation. Her own experience had transformed her from an advocate into a living symbol of the need for change. The department's leadership underwent a major shakeup. Several senior officers who had ignored previous complaints resigned or were demoted. The new police chief, an African-American woman with a strong record of community engagement, pledged to rebuild trust between law enforcement and minority communities. Other states began adopting similar reforms, using the Robinson Act as a template. Police academies nationwide incorporated the incident into their training materials, using it as a case study in how bias can corrupt judgment and abuse power. The senator's dignified response became a model for turning personal injustice into positive change. 1 year after the incident, Senator Robinson stood at a podium outside the state capitol, surrounded by community leaders, reformed police officials, and civil rights advocates. Behind her, a diverse group of new police academy graduates represented the changing face of law enforcement. The department's latest statistics showed a significant decrease in discriminatory incidents and improved community relations. As she addressed the crowd, Angela remembered that night and the handcuffs around her wrists. "Change doesn't come from anger," she declared, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "It comes from turning that anger into action, that pain into progress, and that moment of injustice into a movement for justice." The applause that followed carried the promise of a new era in law enforcement, built on the foundation of one senator's courage to stand up against systemic bias.